increase and decrease by a percentage is what we're looking at in this video. So it's split into 4 parts. We're going to start off by looking at examples like this with a calculator. Then we're going to move on to looking at examples without a calculator where the percentage ends in a 0. Then where a percentage ends in a 5 without a calculator. And then finally where the percentage is a little bit trickier without a calculator. And then as usual, wrap up with an exam question. So the way my videos work, I'm going to do the example on the left, which is I do. You are then going to press pause and I'm going to go at the example on the right, which is you do. So here we've been asked to increase 380 by 27%. So the first thing we need to do is find 27% of 380. Now, we can write 27% as a fraction. So percent just means out of 100. So we can write 27 out of 100, multiply that by 380. And if you multiply that by 380, we will get 27% of 380. Now, that becomes 102.6. But we've been asked to increase this by 300. By 27%. So the final answer is going to be 380 plus 102.6, and that becomes 482.6. So just as a recap, find the percentage you need. Once you've got that, then just increase it. So again, hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at this on the right. So 13% as a fraction becomes that. So first we find 13% of 96, and that is 12.48, and then we increase 96 by 13%, so we just do 96 plus 12.48, and that becomes 108.48. Now moving on, the difference here is we're just decreasing, so the first step is exactly the same. Find 43% of 78. So we do 43% of 78, and we can just use a calculator to do this. And now we are decreasing, so we do 78 minus 33.54. And that gives us 44.46 as a final answer. And again, hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at the example on the right. So firstly, we are going to find, I've written that wrong, 2% of 17. So 2% of 17 is 0.34. And now we're decreasing it, so we're just going to subtract the 2. And that gives us 16.66. So here's some practice questions. Press pause and have a go. Here are the answers. Mark your work. Now moving on, we are now no longer using a calculator. Okay, so here we've been asked to find 20% of, well, increase 300 by 20%. Now in order to find 20% of 300 without a calculator, the easiest way to do it is percentage is always out of 100. So 100% is what we've been given in the question. We've been asked to find 20. The easiest way to do that is to first find 10%. So if I divide this by 10, by 100, by 10 on each side, I will end up with 30. So now I know what 10% is. The question's asking for 20. Well, how do I get 20? Well, I just double it. So if I double that, I now know what 20% of 300 is. So the question is asking me to increase it by 20. And the final answer becomes 360. So just as a recap, the value in the question is 100%. We've been asked to find 10%. The easiest way to do that is to find 10% first, and we can do that by dividing each side by 10. Once we have that, we can double it to find 20%. So again, hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at the example on the right. So here we're interested in 80%. So we start off as usual. 100% is 50. We find 10%, which is 5. And now we need 80%. So I just times both sides by 8. That gives me 40. I've got that now. And the question is asking me to decrease 50 by 80%, so that'll be 50 take away 40, and the final answer will be 10. So here's some practice questions. Press pause and have a go. Here are the answers. Mark your work. Now we're looking at percentages that end in 5. So here, again, 100% is 300. Now to find 25%, I will find 20% and 5, and that will give me my answer. So 10% is 30, 20% is 3. So I found this, but I need 25. So I now need to find 5. Well, how do I find 5%? Well, to find 5%, I can just halve this bit here, because 10% is 30, so 5% must be 15. I've now found this bit here too. So in total, 25% is going to be 30 plus 15, which is 45. Now the question is asking me to increase 300 by 25%, so I just do 300 plus the 25% I found, which is 45, and my answer is 345. So, looking at the example on the right, hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go. Here we've been asked to find 85%. I would find 80% and 5%. So 100% is 140. 10% is 14. And that means 80% is just going to be 14 times that by 8, which is 112. And 5%, so I've got that now. I just need to find 5%. So 5% is just going to be half of the 10%. So 5% is going to be 7. I've now also got this. So I've now got 85% in total, which is 112 plus 7, which is 119. So we now know what 85% of 140 is. So we need to decrease by that. So we just do 140 take away 119, and that gives us a final answer of 21. So here's some practice questions. Press pause and have a go. Here are the answers. Mark your work. So before we move on to the next bit, just to recap on how we're finding percentages without a calculator. So to find 20%, essentially anything you want to find, you can pretty much figure it out by finding 10% and 1%. So 20% would just be to find 10% and times it by 2. Now with 25%, I'll break it into 20% and 5%. And in this case, I would just find 10% and times it by 2. And in this case, I would just find 10% and half it. With 27%, we can again break that up. That'll be 20% plus 7%. So in this case, you can do, again, 10% and times it by 2. And in this case, you can find 1% and times it by 7. So hopefully you can see how I'm breaking these all down. With 2%, I would just find 1% and times it by 2. Effectively, once you know what 10% and 1% are, you can pretty much figure out any of the rest. Now, hopefully you've pressed pause and had a quick example on the right. And there are different ways you can do this. Again, 10% times it by 4. Here, I'd break it into 40% and 5%. And of course, 10% times 4 will give us the 40. And to find the 5%, you can just find 1% and times it by 5 if you want, or there'll be other ways. Again, you can do it as well. Again, I would break this into 40% and 9%. And again, to find 40%, that's already done there. And to find 1%, just find 9% times, find 1 and times it by 9. And then finally, to find 4%, I would just find 1% and times it by 4. So hopefully you can see how 10% and 1% can help us solve all of these in a non-calculator case. So moving on, we've been asked to increase 300 by 2%. So we know that 300 is the 100%. And if I find 1% of this, if I divide each side by 100, I get that. So 2% will just be double that. So 2% is just going to be 6. So for the final answer, that will be 300 plus 6, which is 306. And on the right, we've been asked to find 37%. Now with 37%, I would find 30% and 7%. And the way I would do that is find 10%. So if I just use a different color, find 10%, times it by 3. And here I would just find 1% and times it by 7. So let's have a look. So 100% is 140. 10% is 14. Now that I have that, I know how to get to 30%. I just times it by 3. So if I do 14 times 3, I get 42. So now I've solved this bit here. So I've got 30%. I just need the remaining 7. To find that, I'll just find 1%. So 1% is going to be 1.4, which means that 7% is just going to be times 7. So that's going to be 9.8. So now I also have this. So in total, 37% is 42 plus 9.8, which is 42 plus 9.8, and that gives us 51.8. And the question asks us to increase 140 by 37%, so that would just be 140 plus 51.8. And if you do that, you get your final answer of 191.8. So again, here's some practice questions. Press pause and have a go. Here are the answers. Mark your work. Now, before we look at the exam question, I do want to mention that the way we've solved these questions so far is what we've done is we've gone ahead, we've found 2% of 10. So this is how we've solved them so far. We've converted it to a fraction, found 2%, which gives us 0.2. And then what we've done is we've done 10 plus 0.2, and that's given us our answer of 10.2. Now, the other way you can do this, that's one way of doing it, is you know that percentages are out of 100. The question asks us to increase by 2%. So if I add 2% to this, that becomes 102%. And then I can just do 102, divide that by 100, and times that by 10. And that will give you 10.2. So notice that the answers, either way, are the exact same. So looking at the next one, if you do like this, we know percentages out of 100. We've been asked to increase it by 62%, so add that in. So that becomes 162%. Now, write that as a fraction or a decimal. Also worth mentioning here that, of course, you can write this as a decimal as well. So if I just write this 162 out of 100, times that by 10, I will get my answer right away. There is no need to add anything whatsoever. Once you get to this point, you just times the two together and you just write 16.2. And again, with the last one, we've been asked to decrease here. So we know percentages out of 100. We're going to subtract 18 from it. And that gives us 82%. And now we just do 82 out of 100 times 10. And that gives us a final answer right away. There's no need to do anything once you get that. So that becomes 8.2. Okay, so I want you to press pause and have a go at doing it using this method on the right, because you do need to know it. So in this case, we have increased 24 by 6%. So that becomes 106% in total because we're increasing. So we just do 106, divide that by 100 and times it by 24. I'm not going to worry about the final answer. It's more about how we're laying it out, and that will just give you a final answer immediately. In fact, I will just do it because just so you can check whether you're doing this right as you follow along. So that will become 25.44. Next one, we're increasing by 57. So that becomes 57%. We can get rid of the percent sign. Times that by 24. And that just becomes that times 24, which becomes 37.68. And finally, here, we're decreasing by 33%. So this is going to become 67 out of 100 because you would do 100 take away 33, times that by 24, and that gives you your final answer of 16.08. Now, if you're wondering why I also showed you this method at the end, because there is this exam question that once came up, and feel free to press pause and have a go at this example, by the way, if you want. So Bill wants to increase 150 by 3%. Now, notice the way they've written that is as a decimal, which is fine. So first thing you ask yourself is, okay, how do I increase it by 3%? So using the method I just showed you, it would be 103, divide that by 100, times it by 150. In fact, I'll write it the right way around as well. Okay, now this can be written as a fraction, as a decimal. If I write this as a decimal, it becomes 150 times 1.03. So hopefully you can see where he's made the mistake. Okay, and then Bill's method is wrong, and it says explain why he wants to increase by 3%. And here you would just write, it should be 1.03 and not 1.3. Okay, you're just going to write that there. And for the second part, it says Sally wants to decrease 150 by 3%. So to decrease, we know percentages out of 100. If you take 3% off that, that becomes 97%. So that becomes 97 out of 100 times 150. Now, how do you write 97 as a decimal? That just becomes 0.97. And then you just do 150 times 0.97. And by the way, this did come up on a calculator paper, so you will have access to a calculator here. And that would become that. Okay, so hopefully you can see why I've shown you this method as well. It's just one worth bearing in mind. Now, if you would like some more practice on this, I've got a full worksheet linked down in the comments below. You can find over on my website. And I've got loads of other content in this same format. If you did find this video useful, do check it out.